Good morning, I'm Asira Khanal and I welcome you to today's doubly session of NCEL Nepal Literature Festival 2014. As today's opening program, we have with us a globally recognized figure. His works show diverse area of interest from politics to economics, international affairs, human rights, press freedom, and culture. We've already had a great session with him and Mr. Hari Sharma yesterday on his experience of being politician come writer. He's none other than Mr. Shashi Tharoor. Let us welcome him with a huge round of applause. In today's session, he'll be discussing on the anxiety of audience, and he'll be interrogating his work as an Indian writer in English. He'll be accompanied later by Mr. Prashant Jha, who is the associate editor of Hindustan Times and the author of Battles for Republic, A Contemporary History of Nepal. Meantime, because today is the last day of NCEL Nepal Literature Festival 2014, Mr. Tharoor will also be presenting closing remarks for the program. I hand this microphone over to Mr. Tharoor.
Thank you. Well, I think that, first of all, we all owe you an apology. There was a confusion about the starting time. Both Prashant Jha and I were expecting it to be at 11:30, and we only discovered a few minutes ago that you've all arrived at 11. So the problem is he's not here yet, and I'm here, but it can't be a one-sided dialogue. Now, I was asked to prepare a lecture, and I have the text with me. In the absence of a podium, I will still try and do justice to the substance of it. But I do want to, first of all, say how pleased I am to be here at the closing session of the Nepal Literary Festival, because it's satisfying to realize that my brief stint in politics has not yet disqualified me from the fraternity of authors. And it's a particular honor to be here in the city of Kathmandu, because I had never been to Nepal before, which is embarrassing to admit for an Indian, but I did spend most of my life outside India. And so coming here has been a tremendous extra bonus, and I want to thank the organizers both for inviting an Indian writer and one or two other Indian writers earlier this week to the festival, and secondly for giving me an opportunity to discover your absolutely glorious country. I've seen a fair bit, considering I've only been here less than 2 days, but seen the mountains from up close, seen some of your extraordinary monuments and sculptures, been to 3 or 4 prominent locations, including Patan and Swayambhunath, and today have just emerged from the Pashupati temple. So I must say that this has convinced me that I should have done it a long time before, but certainly encourages me to come back again. So this may not be the last you're seeing of me at Nepal Literature Festival. Now, as far as the broad themes of my lecture are concerned, the format of this is much more conducive to a discussion. So I won't give you a lecture in the formal sense, but I do want to touch on a few themes that I was planning to address in the format of a lecture. The first is the sort of sets of concerns that have animated me in the latter part of my UN career, which lasted nearly 3 decades, as well as the initial part of my Indian political life. And that is the existence in this world of what one might call 2 paradoxical forces, that of convergence and of disruption. What do I mean by that? Convergence would be the phenomena of actually seeing a number of things that are knitting us closer together. Globalization, satellite communications, the internet, the ease of travel, all of these have connected us far, far, far more than ever before. I mean, I don't know how many of you, for example, here are old enough to remember the era of pen pals. In my childhood, if you wanted to be in contact with a stranger from halfway across the world, youth magazines would carry lists of pen pals with their address. You would write a letter, put it in an envelope, stick a stamp on it, mail it, wait a couple of weeks for it to arrive at the other place. Then that person, if they were so inclined, would write you a reply. Again, it would come by snail mail. And perhaps, you know, in this process, 5 or 6 times a year, you might exchange correspondence. And that was how you maintained contact around the world. Today, those 5 or 6 times that took a year to happen are now happening within literally a few minutes with a click of a mouse or several clicks of the mouse. And that transformation should not be underestimated. But the paradox I referred to is that along with this phenomenon of convergence is a parallel phenomenon of disruption, where we are seeing terrorism, we are seeing civil wars, we are seeing the onset of what Huntington, in my view, wrongly predicted would be a clash of civilizations. But in the process, we are seeing a great deal of interconnection between the world, and at the same time, the forces that are pushing us together seem to be also pulling us apart. In some ways, if you look at the experience of 9/11 in New York and of 26/11 in Mumbai, what you see in many ways is how the forces of disruption are able to use the forces of convergence to their advantage. In other words, the very things that connect us, in the case of 9/11, jet planes being crashed into these symbols of global capitalism, while the doomed victims on the planes made last-minute cell phone calls to their loved ones. I mean, it captures, in a sense, exactly how one set of opposed inimical forces can use the other set of what we might have seen as benign forces to their purpose. Similarly, in Mumbai in 26/11, these terrorists came equipped with satellite communications, GPS mobiles. They invaded hotels frequented by the transnational business elite. And it's the same thing. These forces of globalization are suddenly transforming itself into forces of disruption. And I think this gives us an interesting frame for the world in which we live in today and reflect and write. And at the same time, globalization is something we've all rightly, in my view, learned to take for granted. It's there, it can no longer be wished away any more than the weather. And it's truly irreversible. In fact, one of my more awful jokes that I will inflict on you this morning was an epitome of this phenomenon of globalization, which is that when Princess Diana's the tragic death of Princess Diana, the anniversary was celebrated, it was commemorated, I beg your pardon, 10 years after her death, just a couple of years ago. Prashant, don't worry, there's no formal lecture, I'm just chatting while waiting for you. Come. So this is Prashant Jha, and like me, he was told 11:30. I have apologized on both our behalves, we have the same problem. I reached at 11:25, so they've been waiting patiently, but here we are. So you may well ask, what has the death of Princess Diana got to do with globalization? Well, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German automobile with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. She's then chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese-built motorbikes and scooters into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines. And the story is now being told to you by an Indian MP from Thiruvananthapuram here in Kathmandu. There's globalization. But at the same time, along with this phenomenon of worldwide globalization infecting everything, there is also a question of local relevance and local authenticity, which is where the title of what was going to be my lecture comes from, the anxiety of audience. What we mean by that, I'm not a literary scholar, but those of you here who've studied literature are probably familiar with the concept of the anxiety of influence. And in my case, that's not what I'm referring to. It's not the influence of poets and writers long dead and gone that's the factor. The factor here is, what do you do when you are writing in English in the subcontinent, in India or Nepal, for an audience principally made up of your own countrymen and women, but in a language which did not spring organically from the soil of this country. And that is the issue that led me to write. And in fact, if you want to hear my views at greater length, since as I said, we won't do the lecture, we'll just have a chat today, I would urge you to pick up my book, Bookless at Baghdad. Bookless in Baghdad is a collection of reflections on reading and writing. And I have tried to address this issue in greater detail there than I will today. But very simply, the charge was levied from the very beginning against Indian writers in English by Indian critics that this was somehow inauthentic, that to write in what they would see as a foreign or colonial language would in fact be to essentially aspire to an international or a Western audience rather than the audience that validates the writer. Now, this raises a number of problematic issues and concerns, one of which, quite frankly, is the issue of what is a writer's audience and should it be confined geographically, let alone ethnically. To which my answer would truly be probably no, because the entire point about literature is that it aspires to some insights about the human condition, and the particular details of the life of a Nepali peasant, if communicated in English, should have as much meaning and as much interest to a reader in America as the details of an English upper middle class family in Jane Austen are supposed to be of interest to us here in India. What is different about these particularisms? The difference is the language. And of course, in India, the tendency to argue against English was legitimized by the whole anti-colonial experience, the feeling that we have to reject not only British rule, but the trappings that came with it, including the trappings of language. Now, I have a number of problems with that, but the key argument that was made was in the 1960s by a critic called M.K. Nayak, who wrote, the reason that Indian writing in English fails, he argued, is that, he said, the acid test that you should pose to any work of fiction by an Indian in English is, could this work only have been written by an Indian? And he says all the Indian books that he knows fail, that a foreigner could have written it. It's addressed to foreign audiences by a foreign Indian writer. Now, I disagree profoundly with that. And it's partly, of course, the passage of time, because I was born after independence. I grew up in an India where my English did not have the shadow of the Englishman judging either my speech or my prose. I learned English from Indians in India, and I grew up with the language as a language that I played in the playground in, that I passed surreptitious notes to my classmates in when the teacher's back was turned, that I quarreled in, that I wooed my women in, etc. It was the language that came quite instinctively, and therefore the language which I found most natural to express my thoughts, my ideas, my reflections. In many ways, I am of the view that you don't really choose a language chooses you. What is the language that lends itself most naturally to your expression of your thoughts and ideas? And to my mind, for many of us, yes, because of the accident, if you like, of being born in a country that had undergone the colonial experience. In my case, I wasn't born in India, but I grew up in India. So the colonial experience gave us a language which became our own. And I pointed out that even politically, English became a language of Indian nationalism. After all, Jawaharlal Nehru, that preeminent Indian nationalist, wrote his discovery of India in English. So he discovered India in English, and that the intellectual equipment that came through the English language to Indian nationalism meant that English, it seemed to me, lost its sole status as an instrument of the colonialist, but became instead something far more profound and something far more real. Now, if you were to look at this phenomenon, I happened to be 2 days ago in London in a debate at the UK Supreme Court about opposing the motion that this House believes that the Indian subcontinent benefited more than it lost from the experience of British colonialism. And the fact is that amongst the many arguments I used, when people proposing the motion credited British colonialism for giving India the English language, I said, first of all, of course, many have learned the English language without having to go through the oppression of being colonized. Secondly, you could have sent us some toothsome VSOs, voluntary, like their equivalent to the Peace Corps, rather than sturdy master sergeants to impose their language on us. Thirdly, that the concept of English education in India was, as laid out in Macaulay's famous Minute, was actually intended to create an intermediary class between the rulers and the ruled. A group of people, he said, who would be Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, quote unquote. Now, this idea of Macaulay's meant that the English were doing us no favors in giving us English. But the fact that we, our ancestors, seized this instrument of the colonist and transformed it into a language of liberation rather than that of oppression is to our credit, I argued, and not to that of the Brits. But it was a language of liberation. It was a language in which many of India's most original nationalist narratives were written, both fiction and non-fiction. So the first books inveighing against the economic exploitation of India by Britain were written by Indians in English. Ramesh Chandra Dutt, for example, Dadabhai Naoroji. And then you look at the fiction that has come out of India. One of the great nationalist novels is a book called Kantapura by Raja Rao, which was written in English. You can actually find and Mulkraj Anand's work exploring Indian society, particularly in the years before independence. So English was our expression, our instrument, and therefore, to my mind, it's not illegitimate. But to go back to Mr. M.K. Naik's question, could this novel only have been written in English? I would argue for my novels, and probably for many of my sort of counterparts in Indian writing in English, that yes, my novel could only have been written by an Indian in English. It could only have been written by an Indian because the sensibility, the values, the experiences, the reality that I'm seeking to depict could only have come from an Indian heart and soul. And at the same time, the language had to be the language of English as it has grown up and been validated in India. So that, in a nutshell, is my argument. I can validate it with example after example. I myself, as I said, grew up in Bombay High School and Calcutta College in Delhi. The mother of my children was half Kashmiri, half Bengali. The only language that we all had in common and that she had in common with my Keralite mother or grandmother would have had to be English. So English was reflective of a very authentic Indian experience. Any single Indian language is confined by geography to a particular part of the country. It is only English that is equally everywhere, that places us all equally at an advantage or a disadvantage. And so I believe that to have an anxiety about the audience you reach because you write in English is wrong. We've already seen internationally as well, if you look at Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, where he sort of smuggled in an Indian English past the immigration inspectors of English literature and transformed through his writing the realm of the possible in English writing through Midnight's Children and the books that followed. That to me suggests that we actually have in English something which can be an instrument of ideas, cultures, values and sensibilities other than that of the colonist. Well, I've spoken for much longer than I intended to, but now Prashant is here. We'll embark on our dialogue. Let me once again congratulate the organizers of the Nepal Literary Festival for having brought me here and organized this very well-attended event. I've been hugely impressed with the audience turnout at my last event. I see that on a working day with the rain all over the place, you're still here in good numbers for the closing. Thank you for being here, and I wish this festival all success in years to come. Thank you. Namaskar.
I'm still feeling. I'm still feeling a bit gutted about being late, so apologies once again. Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for your graciousness and for starting the lecture. You know what I'll try to do, I mean, is that let me just do if you can just raise your hand so that I have a sense of how many people attended Dr. Tharoor's conversation yesterday, so that we either repeat or not repeat those themes. I mean, many of you did, and if we go back to those themes, I'll try to draw you out on the other elements. I missed the session, but I went back home last night and got it on YouTube so that we can, when you're talking about the anxiety of audience and you're talking about English being used as a medium, the first question that many writers grapple with is who are we writing for? And when you're writing in English, and if you're writing for somebody who is a foreigner but is interested in India, there is a certain element of context that you have to bring in. That context may seem really basic to the Indian reader who already is very familiar with it. How do you do that balancing act? How do you strike that balance between providing the context for the foreign reader and providing some insight which is enriching for the Indian reader familiar with the context?
Right, that's it. That's it. It looks like only one mic works at one time. Well, whoever's running the sound system, try and fix this so we can actually have a conversation. But anyway, first of all, it's a very good question, and in fact, if I delivered my lecture, the question and the answer were part of it. But who do you write for? I mean, and my answer is very simple. I write for Indians like myself, by which I mean people who've grown up comfortable in English, in India, conscious of the India around them, probably more urban than rural, probably better educated than not. But that is the instinctive audience, so that we can share certain cultural assumptions. But as you say quite correctly, if you're writing in a language like English, which has an international audience, and which therefore means that part of your viability as a writer becomes publishing editions in England and America and so on, then, or indeed in translation in other languages, then doesn't indeed cultural context become a problem. But there I have to tell you, India's diversity comes to my rescue. Because if I'm writing for a pan-Indian audience, I cannot assume in any case that a reader in English from one part of India knows about something that I can take for granted in a second part of India. In the Great Indian Novel, which I forgot to boast about, this is, as I mentioned yesterday to those of you who were there, brand new. It's literally not been released yet. It's being released in Delhi tomorrow. I got my first copy hot off the presses when I was in transit at the airport coming to Kathmandu. It is the Silver Jubilee edition of my first novel, published 25 years ago. And what was joyful for me about this was the fact that when I wrote it, it was my first novel. I had no idea it would work. I had no idea it would be read. I had no expectation that 43 reprints later, it would still be being read by a new generation in India in its 25th year. But anyway, coming back to the question, in the Great Indian Novel, I talk about a character dancing the Otam Tullal. The Otam Tullal is a dance, a folk dance of Kerala, which almost nobody outside Kerala knows about. So if I don't describe it and explain it with some context, 90% of my Indian readers won't know what I'm talking about. So I try and weave in these explanations unobtrusively, but because I feel I cannot take for granted what a Hindiwala will know about Kerala or what a Keralite will know about some other cultural reference in other parts of India, I always try and make it as explicit as possible. Some things will not be explained, and indeed one could argue that if you read a British novel, there's bound to be things there that refer to particularities in England that we've never seen in India, and therefore we would not know, but would have to find out about, look it up, ask somebody, whatever. I mean, British middle-class novels constantly have characters using an Aga stove. What is an Aga stove? No one in India has ever seen one. And what's peculiar about it, what's different about it from any other stove or oven, we don't know. So, you know, that kind of thing, there's some things which will always be unexplained in an Indian novel in English. But by and large, I think it is the duty of the writer to ensure that comprehensibility for the vast majority of potential readers has to be ensured. And so far, in my case, I believe it has worked.
You know, you spoke about the duty of the writer. What do you think is the duty of the audience and the readership? Do you expect the reader to do some homework on his or her own outside of the book? So if there is something that you have not specified or elaborated on, you expect a reader who's interested enough to have picked up the book to either do some research on his own, or do you think the book has to be a self-contained unit?
No, I think the book has to be self-contained, but at the same time, if it's a good book and an effective book, it should provoke further thought on the part of the reader, including possibly further research. So if you take the Great Indian Novel, by the way, the title, as I mentioned yesterday, is not my estimate of the contents of the book. It's a reflection of the Mahabharata, Maha being great and Bharat being India, therefore the Great Indian Novel. So I've taken this 2,000-year-old epic and reinvented it as a satirical novel of 20th century Indian politics and nationalist movement and so on, right up to the 70s and 80s, which is when I chose to end the depiction of this experience of India. And in this particular instance, for example, The book is certainly most rewarding to people who both know the Mahabharata and know some Indian history. Secondly, to those who know one but not the other. And only thirdly, to those who know neither. But to all three categories of reader, it does have to work as a novel. So many of my European publishers have translated it into French and Spanish and so on. What did they know about either the Mahabharata or Indian history? But they could enjoy the story as a tale that was unfolding. And so they published it on that basis. Many readers over these 25 years have come to me saying that the novel provoked them into rereading the Mahabharata, or provoked them into looking up episodes of Indian history that I have transmuted into satire in my novel. So that, I hope, is one of the pleasures that reading should give the reader, and one of the triumphs that the author can celebrate when his or her work can stimulate this extra effort on the part of the reader after the book is over. But the book must stand for itself.
One of the interesting things about your work is that you have been very versatile. So you've had readers who are interested in different themes engaging with your work. So a reader who would be reading the Great Indian Novel may not necessarily read Pax Indica, or may read Pax Indica only because of the name of the author who he's familiar with. How has it been engaging with different sets of readers who have read you for your foreign policy insights, who have read you for your novels? And yesterday, as I was telling you, I thought Riot is one of the most stunning books I've read. Or who have read you for, say, Midnight to Millennium in Indian political history. So is there an overlap that you see among readers, or have you come across readers who've engaged with one element of your work and not the other?
Well, I've certainly seen the overlap, because I've had people come to me at I remember in Canada, at the Toronto Harbourfront Festival, I was signing copies of my Bollywood novel, Show Business. And a chap came up for a signature and he said, but you know, the best book you ever wrote was Reasons of State, which I still teach in my courses or something. He's a professor. And I was a bit taken aback, because I wouldn't imagine anything in common between the reader of Reasons of State, which is a heavily footnoted, theoretically laden, scholarly book on Indian foreign policy making, and Show Business, which is much lighter, satirical, frothy, but at the same time larger take on the stories of Bollywood and what it says about my society. Anyway, so there is overlap, but obviously it can't be comprehensive. There are 14 books, and I'm quite sure the number of people who've read all 14 must be a handful in the world. There are some devoted readers who will read anything I write, but there's certainly larger numbers of readers who'll pick up a book because of a particular subject, or a review they've heard, or recommendation of word of mouth by people, and so on, and that makes a very big difference. So in this particular case, it's had the longest life. But some of my straightforward non-fiction about India from Midnight to the Millennium, or my book, The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone, in some ways is so much more accessible that all sorts of people would pick it up who might be intimidated or even put off by the theme and style and sensibility of the Great Indian Novel. It doesn't bother me. I think writers write to be read. All my writing is a reflection of who I am. So to that degree, there is that consistency of intent in all my writing, fiction, non-fiction, whatever. But I don't expect to find too many other people who share the same interests as I do in everything that I'm interested in. So let them read what they find interesting and let them ignore what they don't, and I'm quite happy. I usually tell people, if you like this book, there are 11 others to read. If you don't like this book, don't worry, the 11 others are all very different from this first one, so please read anyway. In fact, talking about the anxiety of audience, there was one professor in Calcutta, Burdwan University actually, who wrote me a very theoretical letter saying, you know, do you believe your text belongs to you? And I realized, my gosh, what a question. You know, I've never studied any theory, any literary theory. I said, yes, in one sense it's mine, because these are the ideas that I had and the words in which I chose to express them. But I fully recognize that once that text is committed to the printed paper, it is no longer yours. I mean, the reader takes it and makes of it what he or she wishes. Critics in particular, I mean, I think painters have long since discovered that art critics can discover meanings in their daubs of paint that they never intended or were conscious of when they did the painting. But if the painting speaks to the critic in that way, maybe there is a meaning that is valid for itself. Prose, of course, words are more limiting than paint, than expressions of paint. But at the same time, it seems to me that there are layers of meaning and intent that different readers will get from different texts at different times. So my conclusive answer at the end was, no, I suppose once I've published, the text no longer belongs to me. It belongs to you, the reader.
as you said, the text belongs to the reader, and I think one of the things that readers expect of writers is honesty in the book. Now, you have been both an international bureaucrat and a writer, and now you are a politician with aspirations for higher office, I would assume, and
At
a
least
writer.
we're coming back into government after opposition.
As the External Affairs Minister, hopefully. But do you think you have been honest as a writer because you also have had, now you are a politician. There are certain things that maybe you could have written about Indira Gandhi when you were not in the Congress party that you perhaps cannot write now that you are a party
But the
member.
point is, I have written it already, so it's there. I mean, I've not pulled my
now in
punches
terms of-
before becoming a politician. Everything I've had to say has been said. You see, I don't change my views. If anyone asks me, yes, I stand up and say, this is certainly what I wrote at that time. I stand by my words. But for me to harp away at it today, as a member and even a spokesperson of a party for whom, many of whose members, she is sort of beyond critique, would merely be provocative. It would not achieve anything in terms of meaningful discourse. I remember in the last election, 2009 election, when I first came into politics, in Kerala we have this tradition of open-air public debates. So there's a lot of audiences like this. And of course, your opponents promptly plant people in the audience because they can ask questions. And there was one fellow from the Communist Party, the CPI, who would sit with a copy of India from Midnight to the Millennium, and every debate, without fail, he would ask for he'd be sitting in the front row, and he would read out some particularly damaging passage I'd written about the Congress Party or Indira Gandhi. And I would listen to him patiently, and I would smile and say, well, the only thing you've forgotten is I'm fighting the elections of 2009 and not the elections of 1977. I stand by what I wrote then about that time. Today is a different Congress, a different leadership, and a different set of values that I'm defending.
You also spoke about the English language in your informal introduction. Do you see, you own the English language and you believe that English is an Indian language. Do you see English as a language of privilege, or do you see it as a language of liberation? I ask this in the context of, when I say the language of liberation, in the context of debates within the Dalit movement, for instance, where we have Dalit activists celebrating Macaulay Divas because they've out for them is the English language, urbanization, globalization. At the same time, you do have people, English creates the new class divide. I mean, those who know English are empowered in the new economy, and those who don't struggle. So does it reinforce hierarchies also? So how do you see English in terms of reinforcing privilege or becoming a tool for liberation?
Sadly, both, Prashant, because the truth is that, yes, it is a language of an educated elite and thereby a language of privilege. But at the same time, as the Dalits like Chandrabhan Prasad and others are arguing, it can be a language that cuts out a whole section of society from traditional forms of discrimination, oppression, caste domination, and so on. And therefore, English can be an instrument of liberation, just as for the Indian educated elite, it was a language that helped them liberate themselves from British colonial rule. I think this mic is a problem, no? Are you hearing me at the back? So, just as it was a language of liberation for the educated elite, it can be a language of liberation for the oppressed and the underclasses. Having said that, I think one of my great regrets is how badly we did, because of our political ambiguity about English, how badly we did in spreading English education throughout the country. I think that had we done that earlier and made English accessible to everyone, whether it's the son of a rickshawala or the daughter of a sweeper at home, that would have actually empowered more people earlier and given them the instrument of their own liberation. So I do agree, to that degree, my greatest sympathies with the Dalit activists who say that we should have used English. Look at it today. You find very poor people who can barely afford it taking their children out of government school and paying extortionate fees to put them into mediocre private schools only because those private schools say they will teach in English. Because they feel that English is the passport to success for their children. And frankly, that's not wrong. But the problem is that the failure of our country to develop a sufficient cadre of English teachers, English language schools, English medium schools, and so on, has reduced people to this desperation of actually getting English education from inadequate and poor sources.
You're in Parliament, and few institutions are as diverse as the Indian Parliament. Uh, can you just give us a flavor of how language and linguistic diversity operates in the parliament? Are the anglicized St. Stephen's lot on one side and they club together, and are the Hindi speaking or MPs from the south who are not familiar with MPs from the south are probably familiar with English, but the Hindi speaking MPs from the Hindi heartland, do they, when you're sitting in the central hall, are those the broad compartments, or is there great engagement between people speaking different languages in parliament?
The engagement is there, but in the formal part of parliament, when speeches are made, there has been a discernible shift. If you read the old parliamentary debates, which I had to do when I was doing my doctoral thesis, overwhelmingly as much as 80 or 90% of the speeches were in English. All of Nehru's great speeches in foreign policy and so on in parliament were in English. But then you saw a gradual shift. With the 1990s, there was an emergence of a new breed of politicians who were simply not comfortable in English, but also fiercely proud of their Hindi and wanted to speak in Hindi. Already in my first term in parliament, a minister from the Congress party from the north answering questions in parliament, if he tried to answer in English, there'd be people like Mulayam Singh Yadav shouting out, "Hindi ne bolo," because you are representing people from the Hindi heartland. And it became very difficult for a Kapil Sibal, for example, whose English is superb, to use English, because every time he began, he'd be shouted down saying, "Speak in Hindi." I got away with it because I represent a constituency in the south. So even though I've had an education in the north, it's not held against me that I prefer to speak English. And certainly southern MPs, many MPs from Bengal and the northeast, are much more comfortable speaking in English, though there are exceptions. One of the best Hindi speakers in parliament is from Arunachal Pradesh, a man called Ninong Ering, who makes very, very good speeches in Hindi. So you've got an increasing prominence of Hindi. Now we have a prime minister who only speaks in Hindi. Most of his cabinet prefers to answer in Hindi questions asked to them in English. So Rajnath Singh, Uma Bharti, with the exception of Arun Jaitley, there's almost nobody in the front bench of the BJP government who will not do that to you. They'll answer in Hindi even if you ask them in English. And that is something which has become a new phenomenon in my second term in parliament. And I would say that the rules, by the way, I should have specified since you asked to explain how it works. In our country, you can speak in either English or Hindi at any time without any advance notice. You can also speak in any of the other 23 languages in the 8th schedule of the Constitution, provided you give 24 hours notice that you're going to do so. So you can hear speeches in Bengali, in Assamese, in Nepali, and so on, provided the Lok Sabha Secretariat has been warned and they can arrange the interpretation. So people do, and you can hear, because very often people are speaking to the parliament, but actually intending it to be heard by their audience at home. So what they do is they make a speech in, let's say, Nepali, and make sure it plays on television in Darjeeling. It doesn't matter to them, and nobody sitting in parliament can understand them.
This debate has particular resonance here because Nepal is also linguistically very diverse.
Yeah.
And while Nepali was the only language spoken in parliament through the 90s, and MPs from the Tarai who tried to speak in Hindi were booted down, now you have people speaking in all languages in the Nepali parliament. So I think this is useful for our audience here. You spoke about the new government prioritizing Hindi. Is that a cause of some concern? There was also this directive that had come out about Hindi being the medium of, I think, communication on social media. Are MPs from the South particularly seeing a revival of Hindi hegemony?
No, there is a lot of worry amongst the MPs from the South about whether, what is often forgotten is there were some very acrimonious battles fought over the imposition of Hindi in the 1960s. And in particular, the Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu, led by C.N. Annadurai, at that point even flirted with the idea of secession on the grounds of the imposition of language. And indeed, the Indian government came up with a so-called three-language formula where every state was supposed to teach English, Hindi, and the state language. But what happened was all the Hindi-speaking states never bothered to teach a third language. There's no UP wala who has learned Tamil in UP. Whereas a state like Kerala teaches English, Hindi, and Malayalam and following the three-language formula. So Tamil Nadu, for example, just refuses to teach Hindi. So they only teach English and Tamil because they feel that it's a way of standing up for their own culture and their own linguistic rights. In this kind of background, it's very unwise to get into the imposition of a language. The ruling party in Tamil Nadu is quite sympathetic to the government in Delhi, and politically they have a lot of cooperation going on. But when something came up in Hindi, it was immediately and most stoutly resisted by that very party and its chief minister, to the extent that when I thought somewhat innocently the government decided to call Teachers' Day Guru Divas, the Tamil Nadu government rejected that, saying they'd prefer to call it Teachers' Day because Guru Divas was Hindi. Now, of course, I mean, the fact is you've got all of these arguments going on at a trivial level, but the larger point is that, yes, people are sensitive about imposition. The great strength of English is that everybody is at an equal disadvantage. If you're born in a Hindi-speaking home or a Nepali-speaking home or an English-speaking or a Tamil-speaking home, you are all learning English, and some learn it better than others. But if you are growing up in a Hindi-speaking home, and you get to speak the language that is your natural, instinctive language in all official communications, whereas somebody who's grown up speaking Tamil or Kannada has to master Hindi, a very different language, different grammar, different gender locutions, different structures, different script, in order to be able to compete on an equal footing with somebody from the north, it'll definitely divide the country. So that's why English is not only a link language, but it actually is an equalizer. Because then that same civil servant from Kannada, from Karnataka, or that civil servant from UP will be on an equal footing writing their file notations. Whereas if the UP chap can read and write everything in Hindi, and the fellow from Kannada who's not from a northern state cadre is in a central ministry having to deal with this, it's not fair. It reduces his efficiency. And that argument is one that I think the government has got to be sensitive to. As far as social media is concerned, the BJP quickly clarified that it was both Hindi and English. And indeed, many do tweet in Hindi and English, but Modi's English tweets far outnumber his Hindi ones because he's got English-speaking staff writing them for him.
We spoke about the audience and we spoke about language. I'd like to return to your writing and the process of writing. I think it'll be interesting for all of us to get a sense of the process and the craft in terms of fiction and in terms of non-fiction. Do you have, when you're writing fiction, for instance, do you have the plot, the structure, the chapterization all set out, or is it a more spontaneous process when you're writing?
Well, there are, as you know, both schools of thought. In my case, it's very much the latter. I tend, in fact, to not know where my novel is going until it's gone there. I have a very broad sense. You need to know at least what your overall preoccupation is that you're trying to play out in the novel. But this novel, for example, I began it just on a whim. I was reading a translation, or as P. Lal called it, a transcreation of the Mahabharata. Was struck by how modern and relevant and contemporary it seemed to me. And I said, what, after all, Ved Vyas, it's said to have composed this 2,000 years ago, but 800 years the story was told and retold to incorporate all the major preoccupations of Indian society between roughly 400 BC and 400 AD. So I asked myself the question, if a Ved Vyas were writing a great Indian novel in the 20th century, a Mahabharata, what would he say? And that's how I started. But when I started, I had no idea how it would go. And I still remember, I wrote 32 pages of typescript, put it aside, almost forgot about it. And one day I was working on something else on my computer. My brother-in-law was visiting from India, and I saw him picking it up and starting to read it. And when he reached page 32, he kept turning and saying, "Where's the rest? Where's the rest?" And I said, "There isn't any rest. That's all I've written." He said, "You've got to write this. It's fabulous," etc. And so that impetus got me to sit down and pick it up. And as you will see if you read the book, it sustains in the end this conceit of transporting Mahabharata characters and episodes from 2,000 years ago to the 20th century. But at each stage I was inventing as I went along. I had no idea whether I'd be able to pull it off, even manage to carry it through all the way through independence to the present day. Now, very different from, for example, someone like my friend Vikram Seth. Vikram, when he writes a novel, he has a huge chart where every scene has been blocked out, what happens in that scene is written. He works everything out and then writes. And that's a very valid way for some writers to do it. To me, though, because I'm writing in competition with so many other pressures in my life, to work to a rule like that would deprive me of some of the pleasure that should come from the process of self-discovery that writing offers me. So I write almost wanting to know what happens, what will my characters do next. I'm finding out as I'm writing.
And a non-fiction, I mean, how do you narrow down on something?
Non-fiction, of course, is different in the sense that, A, you really need to know what your argument is or what your subject matter is. And then secondly, you do need to do the corresponding research that fits into the arguments you're trying to make or that goes into it. So a lot of my writing in non-fiction, therefore, is more structured. In my novels, I can write the whole novel and then impose a structure on it with hindsight. Now that I know how it's all turned out, Do I move things around? Do I create a chapter break here? Do I structure the book in X number of parts rather than, one shapeless mass, whatever? Those decisions I make after the novel is written, because now I know how the novel worked out. But in the case of non-fiction, I should broadly know what my conclusion is before I begin it.
I'm going to, the organizers want me to wrap up soon, but I'm going to take the liberty of asking for some more time, because Dr. Tharoor has not engaged with the audience. I don't think that happened yesterday. So I think I'll open the floor now and we'll take a few questions. We won't be able to take too many questions. Please keep it crisp, because we would like to hear him speak, right?
Yes.
Thank you. I am Toya Bhattrai, a retired civil servant from the Constituent Assembly of Nepal. Dr. Tharoor, whatever you expressed by way of telling us the story of language policy in your country may have relevance to us at a time when we are designing a constitution and also designing a policy. You talked about Macaulay minutes, and we had an incarnation of that called Hugh B. Wood. Wood was a professor of America, and he advised us to have Nepali only during the Panchayat days. So we are trying to emancipate other languages. When I say other languages, the other national languages of Nepal mother tongue. Over the years,
Toyaji, can I urge you? This is very valuable, but if you can ask your question and keep it crisp.
I'm just coining one sentence question.
Sure.
Over the years, from the time of framing your constitution and these days, you have come up with 22 languages in your schedule in the constitution, which was recommended by the Language Commission. We are trying to have that kind of qualification process as well. But could you tell us what has been the experience of India in getting very fragmentary languages into the mainstream and getting them used in the multilingual education process? Thank you.
I'll perhaps take two more questions and then come back to you. That's fine.
Thank you for the mic. My name is Vishnu, Dr. Vishnu Harinepal. I'm former ambassador of Nepal to Japan. I'm your follower in your Twitter. I follow you all the way to social media, in fact. It's a great pleasure to be with you live on discussion. Yesterday also I was present. I'd like to also, on behalf of my audience, of course they will certainly applaud this proposal, that perhaps when you were in the United Nations or so, Mahatma Gandhi's birthday, I like to take privilege from your experience in the United Nations. Birthday on 2nd October was declared by the United Nations as the International Non-Violence Day. And also Nepal, last time I was as an expert member in the Parliament in the International Relations and Human Rights Committee to draft the foreign policy from outside. And I did that, and the Nepal Parliament also has passed. Buddha is common to both of us. It was enlightened in India and was burned in Nepal. And since the world is so much unrestful, and everywhere I think it is full of conflict and the war, even the space is not actually unrestful. It is not it's not in peace.
So with
not Buddha. Yes,
with all respect, if you can ask a question
this
briefly,
is the question.
This is very valuable.
I am the question sentence now, because this was simply the he has to know the background. Otherwise, there is no sense of asking. And Nepal proposed, together with India's support and all over the world, Buddha as an apostle for peace, to declare not only the light of Asia, but also the light of the universe. This is the proposal made by the Nepal Foreign Policy in the last Parliament, because you had the experience that declaring Mahatma Gandhi's birthday as the non-violence day in the International Violence Day. I'd like to take your opinions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll just take one more question and then we'll come back to the audience. The lady there.
Hi, my question.
Sorry, I think I recognize. I'll come back to you later. If we could just start, we can take you.
Thank
we
you,
can
Dr.
move from right to left.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor, for an excellent lecture. And I'd like to just ask a simple question. Which aspects of political participation do you see as fundamental and pivotal in contemporary society?
Thank you for your crisp question. I think we'll go back to Dr. Tharoor and perhaps do one more round.
I'll try
later.
and give, I'll make it short answers. I see a lot more hands coming up there. So first on the linguistic diversity. Yes, we have had a process of expanding. I think when the Constitution first adopted the 8th schedule, there were only 14 languages. and it's gone up now to 23. The fact is that this process is one which is usually responding to popular demand as manifested through political opinion. So when people come to the government and make a compelling case, it's usually approved. And indeed, we even have a language in the list which is not actually organic anymore to the territory of India, namely Sindhi. So, but it's there. And the fact is that India is a country which has tried to be accommodative politically, democratically at every stage. And this is something which is also reflected in language. But you're right to ask, how does it go into the education system? See, in theory, every government school is supposed to provide education in the child's mother tongue. Obviously, there is one child in an entire area who speaks a different language, tough. But where there is a significant minority, they have the right to demand instruction in their mother tongue in a different state from their own. I would argue that the problem there has been the reality of a developing country, where the availability of resources, including the human resources, teachers in that language and so on, has circumscribed the ability of the government to fulfill that pledge. But in principle, it's supposed to happen, and you should be able to get education in your mother tongue anywhere in India. On the non-violence and Buddha as an apostle of peace, the problem for the United Nations has been that, though we all know that Buddha was a historical figure who lived in this country and in mine and accomplished and preached all that he did, he is nonetheless seen in large parts of the world as a founder of a religion. Now, the moment you honor one founder of one religion, there will be an outburst of competition from various other religions wanting to have their founder, absolutely beyond a shadow of a doubt. And the UN simply didn't want to get into that business of once you honor the Buddha, there will be people clamoring for Muhammad to be honored, there will be people wanting Christ to be honored. As an
Perhaps we can
apostle
have
of
that
peace.
discussion later.
And so I see you disagree with me, but the reason it hasn't happened so far is because I'm afraid the majority disagrees with you. I have great reverence and respect for Buddha, but the truth is that this proposal will find it difficult to make headway in an international environment where you have 193 member states following 25 different religions, each of which has their own principles.
So please,
I agree.
let's not have
As I said, I recognize that he was a historic figure. So was Muhammad. So was Jesus Christ. So it becomes very difficult to argue that you're just honoring an individual the way you honored Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi didn't found a religion. The Buddha is seen as the leader of a particular faith. And that is going to be a challenge. In a governmental body like the UN, it will not happen, in my humble view. I think Nepal should certainly advocate it within Nepal and in Buddhist countries and so on, but it will not happen at the international level. And now to the lady about political engagement and participation. I think Nepal is going through a very interesting process now in recent years of much wider expansion of political participation than in the days of the absolute monarchy or in the days when even the democracy existed but was circumscribed. So today you are seeing very much more involvement of people, particularly young people, in various aspects of politics, political organization, NGOs, all sorts of things that are being active and voluble and heard in this society. And I believe that there is no simple answer to your question as to what issues. All issues are equally relevant. An issue becomes important because people care about it. It's not that people should only take up certain issues because they are important. It's the other way around. An issue becomes important because enough people care about it, agitate for it, vote on the basis of it, push it. So something that you and I may consider to be a marginal issue, but that entire section of people says is important for the government to do, well, the fact that they want it in a democracy is enough. And that is ultimately the answer to your question.
I'm under pressure to wrap up the session, but I've extracted permission for one last question. And
three people standing. I think we'll make it three last questions. I'll give very short answers. Yeah.
Hi, I'm away from.
We also started late, so it's no fault of.
I'm away from ECS Media. My question is: the Kolkata writer Neil Mukherjee's "Lives of Others" has been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. This is the first time that the award has been open to any kind of writing in English, any writing in English. So, what kind of change does this represent? What is your opinion on this?
Question. There was somebody who had jumped up there. Yeah. Please keep it crisp.
Thank you, Shashi sir, for being here. As you can see, it's outside and your conversation is kindling a fire of enthusiasm to write something. So how the youngsters like us can write something, can boost our creativity, our writing, how it can be possible, what thing matters the most?
Thank you. One last question, the lady there.
I want to ask about the trends of writing in India. What are the promising trends you see in English writing in India today, especially reflecting on influence of writers of Rusty's generation? And do you think myth is trending now? And are you mythologizing history or historicizing myth in your writings?
Okay, so 3 quick answers. First, on the Booker Prize being open to other writers. Frankly, I don't think it makes much of a difference because certainly for Indian writers, for example, they were eligible anyway. As Commonwealth citizens, they were able to be nominated on the basis of being published in England. The people who will benefit will largely be Americans. Their books will now be eligible for the Booker, which they were not before. But Indians, Zimbabweans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders were always eligible under the old rules. So I don't think it'll be a very big change, because for Americans, their own prizes, the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, and so on, might matter much more to them than the Booker anyway. On the question of what should I advise young people, I'll come back to that last. As far as the trends in Indian writing, I would say that the trends are precisely that there is no one single trend. It's just a whole range of, as the Maoists would say, 1,000 flowers are blooming. And you've got yes, mythical writing and not only reinvention of myths, but invention of new myths which have never existed, reinvention even of religious characters. Lord Shiva has become a man in the Amish Shiva trilogy. Then there is a thriller writer who's using mythical and historical and religious allusions. There's Ashwin Sanghi. There's a lot of this happening in India. There's also a whole new genre of chicklit. There's a whole new genre of rom-coms. Now there's even a new genre of ladlit, of young guys writing about their experiences in college. I mean, novel published recently I received from a 19-year-old called Arjun Krishna Lal, who was writing about adventures in his school or college or university. There's a tremendous efflorescence. All sorts of books are coming out which were never written before or published before. So the great thing about India is there's no one trend. There's everything. You can find any kind of writing now. Myths, history, literary fiction, popular fiction, pulp fiction. It's all there. Even graphic fiction. Everyone is doing everything. And that makes India a very exciting place to be a reader, and indeed a competitive place to be a publisher. We now have 11 major international publishing houses in India, and they're all tripping over each other to grab a share of the reading audience. So it's a tremendously good time. So whatever you can't get in Nepal, make a trip to India. You'll get a whole range of books to choose from. And finally, this question of advice to young writers. I'm very bad at giving advice to young writers. I never took a literature course myself, and I thought that I loved literature and books so much that studying literature would be like learning about girls at medical school. You really had to, savor the experience personally and not be taught it. In fact, my favorite story about writing classes is a story about this Englishman who tells his students, okay, the formula to write a bestseller is it must contain, because he's English, this is 10, 20 years ago, so it must contain sex, mystery, religion, and aristocracy. Those are the key ingredients in Britain. And he said it must be brief. So the students all went away to turn in their submissions. And the best one was exactly one sentence long. My God, said the Duchess of Argyll, I'm pregnant. Who did it? So religion, my God. Aristocracy, the Duchess of Argyll. Sex, she's pregnant. Who did it? Mystery. And it was stunningly brief. So the teacher gave up trying to teach writing. But the simplest answer to give you as we end is I think the best writers are the best and most avid readers. The more you read, the more you will see what is possible to write. The more you will get a sense of how others have dealt with ideas, issues, language, the ways in which they have actually come up with their explorations. Not that you should imitate them or write like them, but the existence in your mind of these various ways of depicting what they have seen as their slices of the human condition can be ways that filter through your imagination to decide how you might want to express your own ideas, your own thoughts, what matters to you in your own language. I think that ultimately, one who never reads cannot be a good writer. One who reads too much will never have the time to write. You must read enough to be able to actually have a sense of what is possible, and if possible for you, expand the boundaries of possibility by doing your own creative contribution. That's all I would urge young people. Read a lot and keep writing. You will learn from your own mistakes, you will learn from your own failures. It's a craft, it's not a science. There is no formula. You will have to keep writing, and as others react to what you've written, you will know how good you are and how much better you need to become. Thanks very much.
That's a wonderful note to end on. I'm sure the House will join me in thanking Dr. Tharoor for his graciousness.
प्रस्तुत छ निशुल्क विकिपीडिया। अब एनसेल मोबाइल इन्टरनेटबाट सबैभन्दा ठुलो अनलाइन लाइब्रेरी wikipedia.org निशुल्क ब्राउज गरी ज्ञान बढाउनुहोस्। एक्सप्लोर धेरै ज्ञान।
Mr. Tharoor, I'd like to take the pleasure of expressing heartfelt gratitude to both of them. Now we'll be starting with a Nepali session here.